My name is Deb Van Dynen. I'm an Associate Professor of English Education at Hope College, and I have the honor of being the NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore Director. The NEA Big Read Lakeshore and Little Read Lakeshore programs are month-long community-wide reading programs focused on the reading of a common book. This year, because of COVID, we've switched to a mostly virtual program. We're excited for the possibilities that this presents us as we can expand our audience's scope and reach, as well as our ability to connect with speakers and experts that are beyond our geographical reach. Thank you for joining us this year as we explore Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Heart of the Sea and Marcia Diane Arnold's Galapagos Girl Gallup Kitten. We hope you enjoy these events and learn lots about the book's topics and themes, as well as issues and important questions in our world today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to be here talking to you today. Thank you to Hope College and the NEA Big Read for featuring me as one of your speakers for the Big Read 2020. I know that the Big Read is usually done in person, but I am still really excited to be able to share everything virtually with you. And of course, today we're going to talk about In the Heart of the Sea, which is the book that we're reading for the Big Read this year, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex by Nathaniel Philbrick. So this is one of my all-time favorite books. It's, as you know, if you're reading it for the Big Read, a very interesting and dense read. So before we start off talking about the book, you're probably wondering who this person is. Why is she here to talk to us about whaling? So let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Ger Tysk. I am an artist and a writer. I am a professional graphic designer, and I do a lot of branding consulting for small businesses and nonprofits. I am also a professional tall ship sailor, and I study the history of American whaling in the 19th century. So I know that was a whole lot of things that don't really seem to fit together. We'll kind of talk about how I actually came to do all these things simultaneously and how they do actually kind of fit together in my life later on in the talk. I live in New Bedford, which is probably the most famous capital of American whaling in the 19th century. So today, as we dive into the book, I'm going to give you a more in-depth look at the American whaling industry, or as they call it, the American whale fishery. I'm going to draw on a lot of my experiences as a tall ship sailor who has sailed vessels very similar to the whale ship Essex found in this book, and also as a writer and a historian of American whaling. So as Nathaniel Philbrick notes in the book, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the great American novel, and basically my favorite novel of all time, is based off the events of the story of the whale ship Essex. But as Philbrick also notes, Moby Dick kind of ends right where the story of the Essex begins. Moby Dick ends as the ship sinks, but Melville never goes into detail about anything that happens afterwards except that Ishmael survived. So survival at sea is a long, very fraught topic that has actually spawned a lot of international conventions and a lot of international seafaring rules. So we'll go a little bit into detail about survival at sea, both in the time period of the Essex and then what we have today, especially aboard tall ships, and about how survival at sea is still really, really important no matter what vessel you're sailing on. And finally, In the Heart of the Sea really touches frequently on the inequalities faced by sailors of color in the 19th century, and especially in the whaling industry. As we all have seen, current events have shown that these inequalities still exist all around the world. And as a woman of color and as a professional sailor, I will kind of go into my experience and my inspirations in the maritime industry and why I decided to join the maritime industry. I am Chinese American. My parents immigrated to the United States from Hong Kong. I speak 3 languages fluently. I speak English, Cantonese, Chinese, which is my mother tongue. And then I also speak Japanese fluently, reading and writing. I've lived in a whole bunch of places. I lived in Japan. I've lived all around the United States. I am an Air Force veteran. I did 2 tours of duty during my active duty Air Force career. And these days I divide my professional time between the graphic design and web design branding career that I talked about earlier. And the other part of my time I spend sailing on tall ships. I have a U.S. Coast Guard Merchant Mariner credential that allows me to sail as a mate on sailing vessels of 200 tons or less in near coastal waters. And I also have an Able Seaman endorsement, which allows me to stand watch. And we'll talk about watch standing more in a minute, what that means and why people do it on ships. So I grew up in Texas, where we learned in school a lot about the Alamo. We learned about the Texas Revolution. We learned about modern US history. When I first read Moby Dick for the first time, I was 26, I think. And the whaling industry was something that I had never encountered. So being from Texas and having this almost foreign industry that I had never heard of, I didn't realize that American industry was built so heavily on whaling. It was kind of a revolution, an eye-opening moment for me as I basically devoured every book I could find on the whaling industry. There were not a lot of books. I was still living in Texas, but the one book that I did come across that made an impression on me was In the Heart of the Sea. So we're going to talk a little bit about the general overview of the whaling industry and how it relates to the whale ship Essex and Nantucket in the Heart of the Sea. So in the book, Nathaniel Philbrick talks about how integral whaling was to the culture of Nantucket. American whaling was the country's first oil industry. Back in the 1800s and 1900s, there was no electricity. There was no way to light your homes except using candles. There was not a lot of really great lubricants out there. So whale oil provided light to a lot of middle class to upper class homes, and it provided a lot of the really high quality natural lubricants that we didn't actually synthesize very well until the 1960s and beyond. So Nantucket, being an island out in the middle of kind of the ocean off the coast of Massachusetts, is kind of a strange place for the whaling industry to first find itself. So Philbrick goes into detail in the book about how it started on Nantucket and why Nantucket became a prominent port. So Nantucket was a prominent whaling port up until the 1820s, which is when In the Heart of the Sea takes place. After the 1820s, and of course the book doesn't go into detail on this because the story of the Essex ends in the 1820s. After the 1820s, Nantucket was pretty much eclipsed by other whaling ports around New England and the Atlantic area. And part of the reason was the sandbar. If you remember in the book, Nathaniel Philbrick talks about the bar at the entrance of the harbor. And in order to grow the whaling industry needed larger and larger vessels that would go out for longer and longer periods of time to fill their holds with barrels of oil. So because of the bar, Nantucket whale ships could only be so big. And other harbors, such as New Bedford, started popping up on the radar of these Quaker whale merchants. And they said, well, we can't build bigger vessels to cross this bar. Let's move. So a lot of whale merchants, and these are all Quakers, moved from Nantucket to New Bedford. And New Bedford quickly became pretty much the richest city per capita in the world by the 1840s, which is the start of the golden age of whaling. Let's talk a bit about the difference between whaling in Nantucket and whaling in New Bedford, because you'd think, well, the same families kind of moved from one place to the other. How different can it be? Well, obviously, the same families decided that Nantucket was too small. We need a bigger harbor, we need a bigger city, we need bigger factories, we need bigger ships, because they built empires off of their fleets of enormous whaling ships and the factories that they had here to process oil once the ships brought it home, and their international supply chains, because places in Europe were buying oil from merchants in New Bedford. What's really cool about New Bedford, especially as a fun fact that I like to tell people as an aside to kind of the whaling industry, is because New Bedford was such an international port, and they were actually an international capital of commerce, because at the time the whaling industry was the oil industry, a lot of really prominent historical figures actually ended up in New Bedford. You might know the name Frederick Douglass, and when he was just starting out on his abolitionist platform, he found a home here because many Quakers were also abolitionists. So they helped Frederick Douglass on his path to become the person we know him as today. So In the Heart of the Sea, basically, to sum it all up, takes place during the very meteoric rise of the American whaling industry to a central industry on the world stage, but also during the fall of Nantucket as a major whaling port. Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, actually shipped out on a whaling voyage in New Bedford. And in his book, he made the Pequod and the Pequod's crew a core identity of the Pequod and her crew were that they were Nantucketers. They weren't from New Bedford. And it's kind of strange why that is until you understand the part that Nantucket plays in the time that Melville was living in, which was when he wrote the book in the 1850s. And Melville probably saw it as a kind of historical fiction, almost to base his characters off of the old whaling industry back in the day, how it used to be. So we talk about the whaling industry rising really fast, and as things that get big really fast often do, it also went downhill really fast. So around the 1850s is when the whaling industry peaked, and New Bedford was the capital of the whaling industry. And then all of a sudden, a lot of things happened in quick succession that kind of spelled the death of the whaling industry. So the gold rush in 1849, a lot of whaling captains and their crew were kind of sick of spending 4 to 5 years out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, not seeing their families, not really making any money. So when the gold rush happened, these crews thought, hey, get rich quick. They went to San Francisco, they ditched their whale ships in the middle of San Francisco harbor, and they went panning for gold. The big thing that people like to talk about, which is the death of the whaling industry, is the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania, which happened in 1852. So the story goes, a farmer was in his field, he was just digging for some water or something, and all of a sudden this oil geyser is just spouted out. That's not quite really happened. That's an obviously very simplified story. Petroleum was known to exist, and some companies were thinking that could be the next big thing because whale oil was expensive and hard to get. Edwin Drake, who first discovered oil in Pennsylvania, was actually drilling, hoping to discover some oil wells. The methods of using the oil were not refined yet. They didn't quite know how to use it, so they weren't sure if it was going to make money or not. But because this oil was so much easier to get than whale oil, quickly became apparent that it was going to probably replace a lot of what the whale oil was doing in the world at that time, such as lighting lamps and lubrication and things like that. So if you think about it in terms of profit margins and economics, you either send out a kind of a leaky wooden boat for 4 or 5 years at a time with a bunch of men who may or may not make it back. They may get killed by a whale, they may sink, the voyage may not be successful. Or you can just drill some holes in the land and make it much easier on yourself. So obviously, when faced with those two choices, the merchants took the easier choice. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 really didn't help the whaling industry. Whaling didn't stop, it kept going, but the amount of money and effort that was put towards the whaling industry as opposed to put towards the war effort. If you were on a whaling ship, you couldn't fight the war. If you were paying for a whaling ship, you couldn't pay for manufacturing for a war effort. The last voyage of a wooden whale ship was in 1924. Her name was the Wanderer. She was a New Bedford whale ship. The company that owned her really wanted to take her out one last time. They knew the whaling industry was dying. It wasn't going to last, but they thought they could have one more successful voyage. They sent her out that night as she anchored off Cutty Hunk. There was a storm, and she basically blew onto the rocks and was wrecked. So that voyage only lasted about a day. We're going to move on to talking about the American whale ship and how its design was really unique to the functions that it performed. And it was unlike pretty much any other ship of the time. So there is one wooden American whale ship left in the entire world, the Charles W. Morgan. She's a New Bedford whale ship built in 1841. And she is currently owned by Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. So let's talk about some of the defining characteristics of the 19th century American whale ship. If you were a person walking down to the wharf in the 19th century and you looked up at a ship, what are the characteristics that would tell you that this is a whale ship as opposed to some other ship of the same time? So the first most defining characteristic is the shape of the ship. American whale ships had a rounded shape with a bluff bow. They were kind of described as like bathtubs, right? And you can compare the shape of a whale ship to designs of clipper ships, which most of us are kind of tangentially familiar with. Clipper ships are part of the mythos of the later 19th century American shipping industry. They were really fast. They made voyages in record time. They did not look at all like whale ships because they were streamlined. If you think of a car analogy, whale ships are kind of like a large truck, and clipper ships were like a Corvette. So if you
as a modern person, look at cars and you say, wow, that truck is nothing like a Corvette. That's what a person looking at ships on a wharf would say when they were looking at a whale ship as opposed to some other faster ship. Every whale ship had whale boats. Whale boats were hung on the side of the ship on these things called davits. Davits were kind of like hooks that hung over the side of the ship. So the Essex had 3 whale boats. Later ships could have up to 5 or even 6 boats if they really tried hard. And they were all along the hot side of the hull, so it depended how long your ship was. The Essex only had 3 because she was not a very long ship. The next characteristic of a whale ship is the Triworks, which is this brick and mortar structure that you see here. And inside this brick and mortar structure, there's 2 iron pots. The invention of the Triworks turned whale ships into the first factory ships because you had the capability to boil down the whale oil and store it on your ship. Whale ships also, not all of them, but a lot of them had these painted gun ports on the side. So they were painted with black rectangles on the side to make them look as near as possible to naval vessels. Whale ship owners thought, wow, whale ships really have no defense except for these kind of harpoons that we have. Why don't we paint our ships to make them look from afar like naval vessels so pirates won't try and attack us? I don't know how well this worked. I think if the pirates were smart enough, they could probably tell from the shape of the ship that the whale ship was not a naval vessel. The last characteristic we'll talk about is the color and the smell of whale ships. And whale ships were notorious for smelling bad and looking bad. And you think about it, it makes sense, right? They're out at sea for long periods of time. They can't put in for extensive repairs because they lose time. They smell bad because they're constantly boiling whale oil. And Nathaniel Philbrick has a great passage in The Heart of the Sea kind of detailing how these men would boil down the whale for days at a time and the smell would just be baked into their clothes. And he talks about how Thomas Nickerson, one of the younger members of the crew, didn't know that you had to wear the same clothes to try out, because if you change clothes every day, you run out of clothes. And so that was a hard lesson a lot of younger kids learned on their first voyage. So the smell wasn't just limited to people's clothes. So the sails of whale ships were known to just be alternately just black from the tripod smoke and then bleached from years at sea because you didn't change your sails all that much. You didn't have money, you didn't have time. This is anecdotal, but I've seen written that you could smell the ship before you saw her. So whale ships were not very popular on the high seas. A lot of ships would give whale ships a wide berth because they just didn't want to smell bad. Moving on to whalecraft, which is the term that whalemen use for all of the various implements you use to hunt and kill and cut up a whale. The most obvious is the harpoon, also known as the whale iron. Harpoons were divided into 3 kinds, and you can see the evolution of the harpoon in this slide that I have here. There's a single flue harpoon, the double flue harpoon, and the toggle harpoon. The purpose of harpoons was all the same, right? Harpoons didn't kill the whale. They just hooked your boat to the whale so that you could be towed by the whale and pull up to it and eventually kill it with a lance. So harpoons were made to not pull out of a whale as the whale towed your boat in the Nantucket sleigh ride. This kind of didn't really work very well with the single flue harpoon. You can see it as 1 barb on the side. Harpoons would fall out of the whale pretty regularly. So whalemen upgraded to these double flue harpoons with 2 barbs. And they thought, well, 2 barbs is going to make it better. It did make it better, but it wasn't until the invention of the toggle harpoon that whales really could tow your boat and you could stand a really good chance of not losing the whale during the hunt. So aboard the Essex, because it was in the 1820s, harpoons are most likely single flue harpoons. They might have had a couple of double flue, but most of the single flue harpoons were just cheaper. The toggle harpoon was invented by African-American blacksmith Lewis Temple of New Bedford, and he took an existing indigenous Inuit design and modified it for the modern whaling industry. And the toggle harpoon would go into the whale just like a single flue harpoon, but when the whale pulled your boat and the harpoon tried to pull out, it would swivel so that you had a perpendicular line, almost like a T shape. And the T shape prevented the harpoon from falling out. And so this really changed the economics of whaling. Other whaling implements or whale craft that were carried aboard whale ships, one was the whale lance, the killing lance, as they called it. And this would be used by the mate who was at the bow of the whaleboat as the Nantucket sleigh ride ended. The whale got tired. The men would pull up to the whale using the line from the harpoon, and the mate would kill the whale by jamming the whale lance basically into the portion between its eyes and its blowhole where you would find the lungs. So you didn't kill the whale by stabbing it in the heart, you killed the whale by suffocating it. And this, as Philbrick mentioned, it was an honor that was left to the mate. These bottom two implements, the cutting spade and the mincing knife, were used on board after you killed the whale. The cutting in of the whale was also done aboard this device that was hung over the side of the ship called the cutting stage. So the cutting stage wouldn't be brought out until you had a whale tied up alongside. And the cutting stage was where men would stand and they would just slice into the whale with their cutting spades. The mincing knife would be used in the blubber room and on deck when cutting the pieces of the whale smaller to be tried out in the tripods. So lastly, let's talk about barrels. And obviously whale ships carried barrels aboard for a wide variety of reasons, the main one being that they needed to store whale oil in the barrels. So all barrels were made out of wood at the time, and they consisted of wooden staves that were curved, a top and a bottom, and then all of these would be held together with metal rings. So barrels aboard whale ships were carried onto the ship, deconstructed in bundles called shooks, and this saved storage space. And the ship's cooper was in charge of putting the barrels together, repairing any barrels that were damaged, and then making sure the barrels didn't leak, because the last thing you wanted was to put your whale oil in barrels, put them in the hold, and then wake up the next day and have a bunch of whale oil just swimming around in the hold because one of the barrels had a hole in it.
So I'm going to switch gears here from just talking about the American whaling industry and start talking about my career as a tall ship sailor and how this all fits into the story of the whale ship Essex. So first of all, we kind of need to define what are tall ships. And that's kind of a weird question because the term itself, there's no one definition. A lot of people agree that it comes from the poem Sea Fever by John Masefield, where he says, all I need is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. The definition that I usually give to people when they ask is that tall ships usually refers to larger vessels that are 50 to 60 feet and above, that are rigged with traditional masts and sails. And they are mainly these days used for education, training, or entertainment purposes. So in the United States, we have a special category of maritime vessels called sailing school vessel. And a lot of tall ships are classified as sailing school vessels, meaning that they are used for education purposes. They are not allowed to carry passengers. So all of their passengers that come aboard need to be registered as trainees or as take an active part in sailing the ship. This is obviously not all tall ships. There's another category of tall ships that are recreational vessels and entertainment vessels. So you think of the ships that do day sails, such as the Liberty Clipper out of Boston Harbor. So she takes people on 2 to 3 hour sails. She does sunset sails. There's a lot of schooners in Key West in the winter that do the same thing. So they're also classified as tall ships. So you can see how the category is very broad. When people ask and I explain this and they still don't understand, the unfortunate answer that I have to give sometimes is it's like a pirate ship. And people seem to get that. If you ask a tall ship sailor, we really, really hate to give that answer, but sometimes there's just no way to explain what a tall ship is to a regular land person. So my sailing career is heavily inspired by this man named John Maguro, also known as Nakahama Manjiro, or John Mung. And he was the first Japanese person to live and to work in the United States. He was one of the first Japanese English interpreters to go back to Japan. He was instrumental in the opening of Japan in the 1850s to international trade. And he later became a professor at Tokyo University teaching nautical science.
Manjiro was born as a poor Japanese fisherman in the south of Japan around 1827, and he was out in a fishing boat with a couple of his friends when he was wrecked in a typhoon. And the boat washed up on the shores of this small deserted island, and he and his friends were prepared to die there when an American whale ship captain named William Whitfield with the whale ship John Howland came by the island. So in 1841, Mangiro and his friends went with the John Howland and Captain Whitfield to Hawaii. Because Mangiro was a fast learner and he had already picked up a lot of English, he agreed to accompany the captain back to Massachusetts. So in 1843, he arrived in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and became the first Japanese person to actually live in the United States.
I mentioned at the beginning of the talk how I have had all kinds of different careers and they don't really seem to fit into one another. And I take a lot of inspiration from the story of Manjiro, who was an immigrant. He came from one background, worked into another background, did all these great things, and then turned all of the things that he did into a rounded life. And so I, as a creative person, and as a sailor, and as a speaker and a historian and an artist, really take a lot of inspiration from that. And I think that there really is no one way to live pigeonholed into one career if you're really interested in a lot of other things. You'll see this sentiment echoed a lot in a lot of tall ship sailors. So every tall ship sailor I've met has had at least 3 or 4 different careers in their lifetime. They have all these different interests that don't seem to intersect, but all we have in common is this kind of sense of, I want to call it sense of adventure, that we want to see what's out there, what more we can do, how we can explore the world and have our experiences enriched by other people's experiences. And that's what Manjiro really did. So in 2015, I did a Kickstarter for this book called Nothing But an Island. It's a photography book of Manjiro's life, and I traced his footsteps from his birthplace in Japan to New Bedford and Fairhaven, where he lived, and then across the country and then back around the world to Japan. And part of that journey was when I started actually sailing professionally. I didn't think that sailing was something that people like me did as an Asian American, but hearing his story kind of inspired me to seek out these new opportunities.
So these are some pictures of my transatlantic voyage from Canary Islands to the Caribbean. I did the voyage aboard an oceanographic research sailing vessel called the Corinth Kramer, and she's owned by an organization called Sea Education Association out of Woods Hole in Massachusetts. She's 130 feet with 2 masts, about 154 tons. The passage from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean took about 2.5 weeks. And over those 2.5 weeks, this was my first really long voyage offshore, you learn a lot about yourself. You learn that being at sea is basically just a microcosm of life ashore, right? You think about being at sea and the romance of the ocean and seeing the waves and the sunrise. Then maybe there are storms and you get seasick. But once you get past all these things, you really just want to have a regular human life as close to possible as normal. So every ship has an established daily routine with regular meal times, which keeps your body in some kind of rhythm. It's a watch schedule, and I mentioned earlier that I'm licensed to stand watch. Watch schedule means that someone is awake at all times to watch the ship, to sail the ship. And so to do that, you divide the crew into various groups. On the Essex, there were 2 rotating watches. The Essex did 4 hours on watch and then 4 hours where you were off watch, so you had free time when you were eating. A lot of modern merchant ships will do 12 hours on and 12 hours off. So you're on for half a day and then you're off for half a day. Much like the Essex, we load food and water on at the beginning of each voyage and supplement with midway at various port stops. So our voyages on tall ships are probably not 3 to 4 years long, but we still need to load fresh produce if you're out for a month or 2 months or 3 months. And even when your ship is not sunk by a whale, there's a lot of challenges of being underway offshore. So the most obvious are probably sunburn and heat stroke. It gets very hot, especially in tropical waters. There's also the unpleasantness of getting seasick. So I used to get very seasick when I first started sailing. There's medication you can take. There's things that you can do to make yourself feel better. Some people just never get over it. The biggest thing that a lot of people don't think about is medical. So even small cuts like paper cuts can become infected. If you have a hangnail, you can very quickly become a life-threatening situation if it gets infected. When the nearest hospital is days away by helicopter, it's a big problem. And then there's just logistical things about living 24/7 in really close quarters with people you don't like. So you try and make the best of it. You try and become good friends with the people on the ship. There's 30, 35 of you. even in the best circumstances, there's going to be one or two people that you just don't get along with. And that's just how life is. And you need to make the best of it. It's not all bad. Obviously, there's cool stuff too. There's charismatic megafauna, which is what we call things like whales, dolphins, large marine mammals. We climb aloft. So when in The Heart of the Sea, Nathaniel Philbrick talks about climbing aloft and the swaying of the ship. When you don't have to do it for work, as the whalemen were doing, when your life doesn't depend on climbing aloft, it can actually be pretty calming to go up on the mast and sit there for an afternoon. Most of our work is done aloft, and when you climb aloft for work, you have to make sure that you are wearing a safety harness, which men on the Essex probably didn't wear. And there's a lot of rules about climbing aloft that make sure you don't fall, and if you do fall, that your harness catches you. Spotting a whale aloft is way harder than it sounds on paper. Everything looks really, really small. You can't determine if the thing in the water is a wave cap or maybe a fish or maybe it's a dolphin, right? And so these whalemen on the Essex had to have months or years of experience. A large part of sailing, both then and now, is navigation. And back then, the Essex didn't have things like GPS. She didn't have radar. So all Captain Pollard and his men had to rely on was what we call celestial navigation, which is finding your position on the ocean using celestial bodies like stars, the sun, planets, and the moon. So on many sail training tall ships, it's still a core component of education. The Coast Guard also really, really pushes celestial navigation because even in this day of modern navigation, if your equipment fails, what do you have? Celestial navigation equipment includes things like the sextant, the chronometer, and various books that have tables in them, including a book called the Nautical Almanac. There's a part in The Heart of the Sea where Philbrick kind of goes a little bit into more detail about navigation and finding your longitude. And longitude, or basically finding where you are east to west on the globe, is measured by knowing your local time in relation to Greenwich Mean Time on the prime meridian. So having a clock on board that told you when Greenwich Mean Time was, no matter where you are on the globe, was really, really important. And these clocks, these marine clocks, were called chronometers. And back in the time of the Essex in 1819, 1820s, they were still really expensive and they were not reliably mass produced. So the Essex and most whale ships at the time had no chronometer. So there's a part in The Heart of the Sea where Philbrick talks about the fact that during their voyage to Ducie Island, the Essex crew gave up measuring longitude. And then after Ducie Island, they determined their longitude by something called a log and line or dead reckoning. In order to measure longitude without a chronometer, they would have to do these things called lunars. And Philbrick explained very briefly that lunars were very hard. The fun fact about both lunars and the chronometer, they were rival ways of finding longitude refined during the same time period. Because back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the way that European fleets would find longitude with this dead reckoning method was sometimes so inaccurate that entire fleets would be lost at sea because they misjudged their longitude. British Parliament put out a contest where prize money would be awarded to the person who could come up with the first accurate way of finding longitude at sea. So the chronometer was invented by an English watchmaker named John Harrison, and he eventually won most of the prize. Using lunars was a rival method, kind of pushed forward by mathematicians and astronomers who didn't really believe that a ship's clock could be invented that could keep time.
So let's go back to the whale ship Essex, and we'll tie it together with sailing tall ships as a modern tall ship sailor. I mentioned that survival at sea is a large topic that has spawned many international conventions about how to help people survive better. Because the last thing you do when your boat sinks, and boats do sink, they still sink in 2020, is to lose all of your crew because they didn't have the correct gear, they didn't have a lot of life-saving equipment that was easily accessible. When the Essex sank, she was a whale ship, and she had extra whale boats, and her crew were mostly all in these whale boats, which was really lucky for the Essex. We all know the story of the Titanic and how she didn't have enough lifeboats, right? So the Essex got really, really lucky in that she did have enough quote unquote lifeboats and that her crew could all, at least in the beginning, climb up into these boats and were saved. Most vessels at the time, if you were not a whale ship, didn't have lifeboats. And again, this persisted all the way up until the Titanic. Basically, when the Titanic sank, the world said, okay, this has been happening for thousands of years and it's not okay. So what can we do to make things better so that ships have enough lifeboats? And they had this convention called the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, which is the acronym. And the most recent convention was 1974. And if you're a sailor or you're familiar with any maritime regulations, a lot of life-saving equipment will say SOLAS or SOLAS 1974. And these are the resolutions adopted by the most recent convention. And so this is kind of an international standard that all vessels should follow, and that they should have these specific life-saving equipments on board in case of an emergency. So I'm going to go through and list the main pieces of life-saving and emergency equipment that every inspected vessel should have. And when I say inspected vessel, each vessel that's registered in a port of a certain country will be inspected by the Coast Guard or the maritime governing body of that country. So here in the United States, we are inspected by the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard will come and they will look at your list of life-saving equipment and say, do you have this? If you don't have it, why don't you have it? If you have it, does it work? When was it last inspected? And then also the crew needs to do safety drills at determined periods of time to make sure that not only do you have the life-saving equipment, but the crew knows how to use it. Because the last thing you want in an emergency is for the ship to be sinking and the crew doesn't know how to launch the lifeboat, right? That doesn't do you any good if you have the thing, but the crew can't launch it and they die.
So the first thing I want to talk about with modern survival equipment are these inflatable life rafts. And inflatable life rafts are carried by tall ships. If you've ever been on a cruise ship, you'll see that there are full lifeboats hanging from the side of the ship that don't need to be inflated. But inflatable life rafts are great because they're stored in a small space, but then can inflate in an emergency to fit many, many people. They're designed to either be thrown overboard, and if you pull a long piece of cord called a painter, they will inflate and burst out of their shell. You see this white shell here. Or if the ship sinks to a certain depth, they will automatically float free of the ship and inflate on their own. So this is really great if the crew is incapacitated, they can't get to the life raft in time, the ship is sinking, they will eventually be able to climb into it. On this same slide here, you see emergency food ration and emergency drinking water. So all life rafts are equipped with a emergency kit, which when the life raft is inflated, you'll find inside. And these include these food and water rations. As you can see, the food and water is not really ideal. You don't want to really eat them on a regular basis. They do provide calories. And the emergency rations packed in the lifeboat kit are enough for you to survive for about 5 days. You're generally told not to consume anything for the first 24 hours because your body is still processing the food and the water that you ate the day before. And then after the first 24 hours, you can start handing out rations. Other things included in this emergency kit can be things like flares, a water bailer if water is coming into your life raft, patch equipment for the leak in the life raft, there's first aid supplies. There can also be a little water still so you can make more water if you need more fresh water. The reason that the supplies are only intended for about 5 days is that these days with GPS and things like that, you aren't really expected to float in the water in your life raft for months at a time, like the survivors of the Essex. So speaking of GPS, let's talk about some modern inventions that allow ships to be found at sea quickly. So the first thing we want to talk about is called the AIS, or the Automatic Identification System. There's a screenshot here from a website called Marine Traffic, and all these little dots are boats. And if you click on each one of these dots, it'll tell you the name of the boat, how fast it's going, and sometimes where it's going if the person has plugged that into their AI system as well. The thing next to it, the EPIRB, also works with the worldwide GPS system. EPIRB stands for Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon. So just like the life rafts, EPIRBs can be activated manually or they can be activated automatically upon immersion in salt water. And so the EPIRB will send a signal to a satellite network, and then that's how people will be able to find you. And if the EPIRB is activated, it is automatically assumed that you have had some sort of marine accident. Another really great tool we have on board is called an immersion suit, or sometimes called a survival suit. It's a very, very buoyant neoprene suit. When you put it on, sometimes we call them Gumby suits. You can see why. when you see this guy on the left putting it on. On the right, here's me trying on an immersion suit during a shipboard drill. Standard immersion suits on vessels come in generic sizes that will fit most adults and most children, depending on the size you pick. And the procedure is that when you have an abandoned ship event, you think your ship is sinking and you're directed to abandon ship, you will put your suit on deck. And then you're not supposed to go below because these suits are so buoyant that if you go below and the ship is flooded, you won't be able to get out of the compartment. These suits are designed to preserve body heat, so they're not necessarily really completely waterproof. You don't want your suit leaking out of any seams, but also water will naturally come in openings, such as the opening of your hood. And using that water that's coming in, you'll keep your core body temperature constant so you won't have hypothermia. And the main buoyancy test of an immersion suit or a survival suit is that the suit is designed to enable you, the person wearing the suit, to turn from face down to face up in the water within 5 seconds. Modern steel vessels will also have these additional safety features below decks. So they will have watertight doors, which will close and completely seal so that water can't get in the compartments. Modern vessels also have electric bilge pumps. So the bilge is the very, very bottom part of a ship. And on wooden ships, which all leak because it's impossible to make a completely watertight wooden ship, a lot of water will just seep into the bilge naturally. So on ships like the Essex, obviously you had to pump manually. Modern ships will have electric pumps. You push a button and the water will pump out. So you're saying now we have all this modern equipment, we have electric bilge pumps, we have watertight doors, we have life rafts, we have all these inspections. Do tall ships still sink? And the answer is yes. So some of you might remember the tall ship Bounty, which was a 1962 replica vessel that was built for a movie set, Mutiny on the Bounty. The Bounty actually sank during Hurricane Sandy in October 2012. 2 of her crew were lost, and the other members of the crew survived for about 3 days in their life rafts until they were rescued. It was a really terrible wake-up call for the tall ship industry and just the American maritime industry in general, that these things do happen and people still die. And even with all the safety equipment, sometimes it's not enough.
So at the end of our time together, what can we take away from In the Heart of the Sea as relating to the whaling industry and also the modern maritime industry? The first thing I want to touch on is whaling was America's first equal opportunity industry. Even though the men of color were not treated the same as the white men, they were still allowed to work in the same space. It didn't matter what, as long as you could do the job. My inspiration, John Maguro, who was a Japanese person living in the United States, by his time, the New Bedford whaling industry had evolved to the point where men of color could be given higher positions if they really proved themselves. But even then, the tolerance was really limited. So still, most of the common sailors were men of color, and only the officers were white. So Maguro, who had been rescued from sea by a very prominent white whaling captain, still could only ship on board as a steward or as a cooper. And those 2 positions were very, very common positions for men of color who could demonstrate that they had more skills than just a common deckhand, but they still couldn't become officers because they weren't white. So in many ways, the whaling industry was ahead of its time in that it was equal opportunity to a certain extent. It could have done better, but as we look at history, it did what a lot of industries at that time were not doing. We also can't talk about whaling with obviously talking about environmental sustainability and environmental awareness. The invention of the temple toggle that we talked about earlier allowed more whale boats to bring in more whales during their Nantucket sleigh ride as the harpoons wouldn't pull out. But still, most of the damage that was done to worldwide whale populations didn't happen until the late 19th century, early 20th century with the invention of the Norwegian harpoon gun. And that's when whale populations started really to go downhill. So whale products, before the invention of plastic and synthetic lubricants, made up a large part of the American goods system. So for whale ship owners and merchants and even captains at the time, mounting a harpoon gun was a logical choice if you wanted to make more money, because you needed to make more money, you needed to sell more of these goods. People wanted it because we didn't have plastic. As we've also talked about during this entire time, whaling was a really hard job and people would die very frequently. And you would also come home with not a lot to show for 4 or 5 years at sea. So it was in the minds of the people at the time a logical invention to kill more whales with a higher success rate, bring home more money, and have more people survive. Now, again, we're looking at it through the lens of history and trying to balance the industry of the time and honoring the memory of those whalemen who went out and were doing the best they could, while realizing that yes, they did contribute to the decline of the whale population worldwide and probably a lot of lasting environmental damage. And lastly, let's talk about resilience and human ingenuity in the context of the whaling industry. So there's a very famous quote from the book Moby Dick: a dead whale or a stove boat. A dead whale, you kill the whale. A stove boat, stove comes from the word to stave or to stave in, and that means that your boat is crushed. And usually that was used in the context of you are on the Nantucket sleigh ride, you're being pulled by the whale comes up and hits your boat and smashes it. So a dead whale or a stove boat, you either kill the whale kills you. And that was a lot of what was the heart of the whaling industry at the time. And these men who would go out for years at a time and not know if they would make it back alive were going because they needed to provide for their families. They were men of color and they couldn't get hired in any other industry, or that was what their family did. That's what they knew. Being part of an industry that was so brutal took a lot of courage. There's also people like Lewis Temple, who invented the temple toggle, and John Maguro, who were people kind of on the fringe of the outside of the industry that still use the industry to make something great of themselves. And then let's talk about the crew of the Essex that survived. So Captain Pollard, Owen Chase, Thomas Nickerson, and a couple of others that you would think they would come back to land and they would be like, I'm done, no more whaling. I'm really tired of the sea. I almost got killed. I'm not going back out there. But every single survivor went back out and kept working in industry. I can't understand what it's like to starve at sea and to see your friends die as you lie in the bottom of a whale boat. But I do understand as a sailor that once you decide it's a career that you want to pursue, it's kind of in your blood. So a lot of my fellow sailors will know that when you're on land for a long period of time, all you want to do is go back to sea. And that's something that I think we can take away from the whaling industry, and also as a nod to just the human experience of the need to return to something familiar and to return to your roots. And I think basically that kind of sums up the history of whaling in America, is a lot of people trying to make something of themselves and also to go back to their roots.
So in conclusion, here's some further reading if you're interested in any of the widely varied topics I talked about. Obviously, Moby Dick is a really great, if sometimes fictionalized account of the American whaling industry. For a more factual account of the American whaling industry, you can read Leviathan by Eric J. Dolan, which is a kind of comprehensive history of the industry, but it's a really great read. It's not super dry. I really recommend it. Another really great historical read is Longitude by Deva Sobel, which talks about the longitude problem, the prize money put out by the British Parliament in order to solve the fact that British warships couldn't find longitude, and then the invention of the chronometer by John Harrison. I also want to recommend The Gathering Wind by Gregory Freeman, which is an account of the sinking of the tall ship Bounty, and Drifting Toward the Southeast, which is John Mangiaro's autobiography, written about his life and journey to the United States and then back to Japan. Also, here are some really great links to museums and historical associations that have to do with the history of American whaling. I would recommend checking them all out. I want to call attention especially to Tall Ships America, which doesn't really have to do as much with whaling, but is a membership organization that brings together tall ships and the organizations that run those ships, and then fans of tall ships across the country and even across the world. So if you're looking for a specific ship, or you want to see if you can go sailing on a specific ship, I would check out Tall Ships America. I really, once again, want to thank Hope College and the Big Read for letting me talk about one of my favorite subjects, the history of American whaling. If you want to know more about me, you find where I'm speaking next or more of my work, you can find me at gltisk.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at Ger Tysk. Thank you so much.
All right. Hi, everybody. I want to say thank you to all of our readers for joining us tonight. My name is Kylie Galloway, and I am the marketing manager for the Big Read Lakeshore. Thank you so much for that presentation, Jer. I just loved how you incorporated history and your own personal experience and incredible adventures, and I learned so much about sailing. We're going to now transition into a Q&A, and I will introduce Grace Goskowitz, who will be moderating our Q&A with Jer. Speaking of, you can drop your questions for Jer in the chat feature on YouTube or Facebook now. Grace is a junior at Hope College studying chemistry for secondary education. She's a campus tour guide, a young life leader at a local high school, and the current Commodore of the Hope College sailing team, which she has been enthusiastically involved in since arriving at Hope 3 years ago. We think Grace is the perfect person to moderate this Q&A. Grace, take it away.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, and now I'm going to introduce Ger, who we just heard from in her recorded video. She's a fantastic individual who has, as you heard, studied whaling and sails tall ships professionally now as part of her professional career. Welcome, Ger.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I was really excited to talk about my favorite topic.
Yeah, it was great to hear from you. Like Kylie said, I just learned so much, and I loved. We were just talking. It's such a great exam week for us Hope College students. Break
If
for
your
us
professor's
to,
giving you an A.
yes, learn something else and
Right.
think about something more interesting. We have a comment here. A question about the percentage of female sailors in the industry from Claire Van Dynen. And you talked a bit about representation in historical sense, but can you talk more about currently how that is female-wise and maybe even racial as well?
Sure. Obviously, historically, there were no female sailors on whale ships. There's anecdotes of several female sailors like hiding out and pretending that they were men and being discovered. And then most whale ship captains could bring their wives if they chose. But traditionally, women on boats were seen as unlucky. So you didn't want to have a woman on your boat because bad things would happen. Funnily enough, these days, I would say that the tall ship industry is at least 50-50, male or female, if not more. Most of the sailors that I've sailed with are female or female identifying. There's also a very, very big portion of the tall ship industry that is in the LGBTQ community, which is really great. So that is a great mixture of, a makeup that is very different from the olden days of sailing. In the maritime industry worldwide that is not the tall ship industry, so commercial shipping and oil rigs and things like that, the percentage of women in the industry is still very low. And that's still seen as a blue collar male job. And one of my friends runs a nonprofit called Women Offshore, which is doing a great job of kind of bringing together a lot of women in the entire maritime industry, which is not just tall ships, but commercial also. And so women can have a safe space to talk about being a woman in maritime.
Awesome. Yeah. There are a few more comments and questions about your experience, and you talked a little bit more in the video, but let's see. There's a question from David Van Dynen. What do you do in your free time on a sailing adventure?
Good question. There's not a whole ton of free time on a sailing adventure. I guess for you guys, it's an adventure. For me, it's just going to work, right? Except I work where I live. And so you're just there 24 hours a day. And because everyone is awake at certain specific times in the day, there's always someone awake. And I talked about the watch schedule. And so you're pretty exhausted when you're not working. Most people just want to sleep. If you're not sleeping, you're not working, you're probably eating. If you're not doing those things, people like to play. There's like board games. You can play board games. Music is also a really great thing to do on deck because tall ships, one of the advantages that we have is we're sail powered, so we can turn the engine off And so what people think of like the romantic notion of, you know, playing your guitar on deck as the sun sets and people are like watching the waves and the dolphins are jumping, that does happen. So that's not a lie. That does happen. And it's like really great. And so that's like 1% of the time that you're on the boat, but that makes up for all the other 99% of the times when you're woken up at 3 a.m. and it's raining and it's like 40 degrees outside and it's
I agree.
miserable.
I agree. My family has a small sailboat, not a tall ship by any means, but a small single family sort of ship and sailboat. And that moment when we turn off the engine and it's just quiet, sun is
You're like,
setting,
I
and
want to
I'm
do
playing
this
my
for the rest
guitar.
of my life.
Ah, that moment, like Ger said, makes up for everything. There's another question, and I thought it was interesting about Kylie Galloway is asking, there are so many emergency supplies, like you talked about in the video, that the Essex clearly didn't have. Which of these supplies would they have most benefited from?
I guess all of them is not an answer. Let's see. The emergency food and water would be a big one because they're in packets and they keep for years. So as long as you don't open the packet, they don't taste very good, but they're not going to go bad because the biscuits. I don't know if you remember in the slide, those are pretty hard and you break them off as you open the packet. And the water comes in those little like foil bags. They would probably have benefited from that solar still also. Then you can just make your drinking water and you wouldn't have to be so thirsty that you're trying to drink seawater and you get dehydrated. And then I guess GPS is not really a thing, but they would have really benefited from the GPS so they could, you know, see where they were going.
Yeah. Yeah.
There wouldn't have been a book. It would have been great.
Yes. For the drama. Abigail just posted one. Abigail Nonner, what is your favorite maritime history story to tell? So it's going all the way back to your historical account, whether it's about Nantucket and all you talked about in the video or something else.
Putting me on the spot. Besides the story of John Maguro, who just like really, really inspires me, I guess it would be the story of the invention of the chronometer, which I also talked about in the video. It's not really any new information, but the invention of the chronometer was, I think, in my opinion, probably one of the single most important inventions in maritime history. And you can still see John Harrison's clocks today. The exhibit came to Mystic Seaport in Connecticut a couple of years ago, and I went to see it. And you walk through the room, and there's these huge clocks because he had to design a clock and that would keep time on the deck of a ship, and the ship is moving about. And back then, clocks had pendulums. So he had to design a clock where the pendulum would not lose time as the ship was moving. And he went through 4 iterations before he finally designed basically what we think of today as a pocket watch. And that was just, it blew the minds of everybody. They couldn't believe it worked because it wasn't a pendulum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To close, I'd like to ask my own question about your experience. And you talk a little bit about this desire for adventure and how you want all of these experiences to be shaped by others' experiences and to shape others' experiences as well. And I guess when I read Moby Dick or In the Heart of the Sea, I don't really want, even as a sailor who craves the water in the sea, I don't really want to go to ocean. So I want to hear about your experience and how you felt that call to adventure and to a life sailing that you've never even done before reading that book.
When I read Moby Dick, I think the thing that called me was, it was a story I didn't know that was so important to the history of this country. And as I said in my talk earlier, I learned all about Texas history and the general history of the United States. But this was an industry that was so important and was so groundbreaking, and it was so important to the lives of a lot of people of color that couldn't get jobs in any other industry. And I thought, why aren't we telling this story? And so I think I felt called to that more than like the romance of the ocean or whaling or anything like that. So to me, Moby Dick and sailing is more a function of being a person that is inspired by the footsteps of people of color that came before me and people who were brave and people whose stories are important to the forming of the country, even though, you know, we don't talk about those stories like we talk about George Washington.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I think that's such a beautiful question to end on. Thank you for asking that, Grace.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone for your amazing questions tonight. Thank you, Grace, for beautifully guiding that conversation. We really appreciate you. And a big thank you to you, Ger, for taking the time to create such an amazing presentation and thoroughly answering these questions. I know I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our Lakeshore readers did too. As a reminder to everyone watching, we still have a few events left in our program this year. You can check them out on our website, bigreadlakeshore.com. Thank you to everyone who participated in this event, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your Tuesday evening.